reached its conclusion, and the subsequent quiet was profound. The once dominant sovereign, a renowned warrior, now rested amidst the debris, his physical form broken, his protective casing in shards, and his vast dominion in utter disarray. He had engaged with exceptional bravery, guiding his diverse legions with a caliber of command that had formerly earned him reverence throughout the cosmos. Yet, ultimately, it was not the might of his adversaries that led to his downfall, but rather treachery originating from within. With each labored gasp, a painful confirmation of his dire wounds, he surveyed the scene of conflict, seeking any indication of his confederates. Not a soul was visible. The warrior monarch's mind grew poisoned with despair as he grasped the stark reality. He had been left to perish. His most loyal officers, beings from extraterrestrial civilizations that had pledged unwavering loyalty, had forsaken him precisely when his need was greatest. He had dedicated his all to this sprawling realm, unifying disparate species previously locked in hostilities, only to be cast aside once his purpose had been fulfilled. He attempted to stand, but his corporeal structure resisted, his formerly formidable physique, once capable of inspiring and directing. Now the martial forces on the field of conflict lie prostrate in the dust. Their former confederates as starships vanished, mere distant glimmers in the heavens as they withdrew from the fray. He comprehended their departure. Their gazes betrayed their conviction that his era had concluded, that his injuries were too grave. He was no longer the unyielding commander they had followed through innumerable triumphs. He was a burden, and burdens held no currency in a dominion founded upon might and supremacy. As the stark truth solidified, the warrior king's pride flared with an intensity exceeding the agony of his wounds. He had been their sovereign, their bulwark, the unifier, under a single emblem. Now, they had abandoned him on this desolate orb, presuming his demise, alone and forgotten. His thoughts churned with indignation and incredulity. How could they forsake him after all they had endured together? He had shed his blood for them, guided them through wars, subjugated their adversaries, and yet, at the crucial juncture, they had cast him aside like detritus. The surrounding panorama was as barren as his prospects for survival, rocky, desolate, utterly devoid of any succor. It was the quintessential locale for an abandoned monarch to perish. He clenched his fists, a futile gesture of defiance against the inevitable. His strength waned, and he knew that without swift aid, his dominion would not simply cease to exist. He would too. Yet the warrior king was not one to yield. Even now, with the weight of treachery pressing upon him, he refused to permit his foes, or his so-called allies, to prevail. He would discover a means to endure, even if it meant crawling for leagues across the grit. He had always battled against overwhelming odds. This occasion would be no different, even if the adversary was death itself. As the hours ticked by, the king's mind drifted to the very races that had deserted him. He contemplated their cold rationality, their calculated choices. To them, all was a matter of potency and advantage. The instant they perceived his weakness, their decision was made. It mattered not how many victories he had led them to, how many enemies he had annihilated. In their eyes, the past held no significance, only the present, and in this present, he was expendable. He cursed them all under his breath, yet deep down, he grasped their logic. That was their inherent nature, pragmatic to a fault. Allegiance held no sway in their world, a concept they deemed suitable only for lesser beings. The warrior king had learned that lesson in the harshest manner. In the haze of his suffering, he could feel life receding. Time was running out. His intellect, still sharp despite the pain, struggled to cling to a sliver of hope, a possibility of escape. But none existed. His dominion was lost, his confederates had abandoned him, and here he lay, a once great ruler facing his end in solitude, on a planet where no one would ever discover him, or so he believed. The last thing the warrior king anticipated was a second chance. Yet even as darkness encroached upon the periphery of his vision, his mind braced for the conclusion. Something stirred in the distance. It was not whom he expected. The king, barely conscious and hovering on the precipice of oblivion, could discern faint sounds, voices. But they were not the guttural utterances of the alien peoples he had once led. They were not returning for him. No, these voices were distinct, soft yet resolute, human. His muddled consciousness struggled to comprehend. What were humans doing on this desolate world? A group of human explorers of all beings had stumbled upon him. He felt a surge of affront. How had it come to this? The mighty warrior king, discovered in his most vulnerable state by the very species he had once derided. Humans, in his estimation, had always been the most feeble of galactic races, too tender, too sentimental. They lacked the ruthlessness essential for command, for conquest. And now, they stood over him, deliberating on how to assist. He attempted to snarl, to berate them into leaving him to his fate, but his body refused. All he managed was a hoarse whisper, and even that cost him his meager remaining strength. The humans, however, did not retreat. They did not mock his predicament or abandon him like the others. Instead, they knelt, examining his wounds with concern and speaking in tones filled with empathy. He could sense the hum of their medical equipment as they began attending to his injuries, despite his silent protests. This was not how he had envisioned his demise, and yet he was not. Against his own pride, against his desire to face death on his own terms, the humans refused to let him perish. Days elapsed, though the passage of time blurred as he drifted in and out of awareness. Each time he awoke, he saw them toiling tirelessly. They provided him with sustenance, with hydration, and mended his broken form as best they could. His injuries were severe, far exceeding the capabilities of the humans' rudimentary instruments, yet their persistence was unflagging. They worked with a quiet resolve that baffled him. Why? Why would they expend their efforts on him? He had never accorded their kind any respect, never considered them anything more than insignificant beings. Yet, here they were, pulling him back from the brink of death. He detested it. His pride railed against him, urging him to push them away, to refuse their aid. He needed no humans. He needed no one. Nevertheless, each time he attempted to voice his objections, he found himself lacking the strength. His body betrayed him, leaving him at their mercy. They asked for nothing, no pledges, no fealty, no recompense. It incensed him. He had always understood relationships to be transactional, alliances forged from necessity, maintained through power and apprehension. But these humans seemed to operate by entirely different principles. They assisted because they desired to, because they believed it was the right course of action. It made no sense to him. How could a species so driven by such irrational ideals survive in a galaxy that rewarded only strength? He observed them in silence as they moved about their encampment. Their conduct perplexed him. They shared jests with one another, recounted tales, and even appeared to relish their time on this barren planet. Their bond was evident, but it was not forged through dominance or fear, as he had come to expect from the myriad species under his command. Instead, it was built upon something deeper, something he could not quite grasp: trust, loyalty. These were words he had long discarded as naive notions, unworthy of the brutal realities of power. Yet, these humans embodied them. One of the explorers, perhaps their leader, approached him more frequently than the others. She possessed a serene demeanor, asking few questions and affording him ample space to recuperate, but her actions spoke volumes. She did not regard him as a dying remnant of a defunct empire. To her, he was simply another life worth preserving. There was no hidden agenda, no ulterior motive, just a simple, undeniable compassion. It was bewildering. The days crawled by, and gradually the warrior king's physique began to mend. Not entirely, not yet, but sufficiently for him to sit upright, to move with a measure of autonomy. The humans had restored some of his vigor, and for that, he loathed them even more. It would have been simpler to perish, more straightforward to let the torment cease and his empire's story fade into obscurity. But they had denied him that. Now, he was indebted to them, and that was an even greater burden to bear. Nevertheless, despite himself, he began to observe them more closely. Their resilience was something he had not anticipated. They lacked the advanced technology of the races within his former dominion, yet they made do with what they possessed, transforming limited resources into instruments of survival. their inventiveness, their adaptability. It was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. There was strength within them, after all, but it was a distinct kind of strength, one that did not rely on sheer force or superior firepower, but on the capacity to endure, to persevere in circumstances where others would falter. He could not fathom it, but he began to respect it. The humans, for their part, did not pressure him for conversation. They granted him the solitude he required to process the situation, to heal at his own pace, and slowly, despite the voice within him urging him otherwise, he began to place a degree of trust in them. Not complete trust, how could he? But enough to permit their presence without the constant need to remain on guard. This was uncharted territory for him. He had ruled through fear, maintained his empire with an iron grip. These humans harbored no fear of him, yet they exhibited more loyalty during these few days than any of his alien allies had ever demonstrated. It was disquieting, but it was also irrefutable. Perhaps in this moment of vulnerability, he was perceiving something he had previously overlooked. Strength did not always emanate from obvious origins. Power was not solely about control or subjugation. Perhaps there was indeed something to these humans after all. As his strength progressively returned, he started to contemplate his next maneuvers. His dominion might be lost, his former confederates dispersed, but he was not yet deceased. And as much as his pride had been wounded by their abandonment, it had also been tempered by the realization that not everyone perceived him as expendable, at least, not these humans. For the first time in his existence, the warrior king pondered if, perhaps, just perhaps, he had underestimated humanity. As the days unfolded, the warrior king's fortitude gradually recommenced. His physique, once battered and broken, was healing, and with each passing moment, he found himself observing the humans with increasing scrutiny. What they lacked in physical prowess or technological solutions, they compensated for, with an undeniable tenacity. They moved with intent, even in the most minor of tasks, and their camaraderie was something the king had never fully comprehended during his tenure as a sovereign. In the tranquil intervals of his recovery, the humans shared accounts of their own trials, the battles they had fought, the hardships they had endured. They spoke of Earth, their homeworld, a planet ravaged by conflicts, calamities, and challenges they had surmounted through sheer determination. It was unlike anything the warrior king had ever heard from any of the alien species he had commanded. Their narratives were raw, tinged with loss, yet brimming with optimism. It dawned on him that humanity's greatest asset was not in their armaments or their numbers, but in their capacity to withstand the unimaginable. For the first time, he listened, truly listened, to their sagas. They were not conquerors by nature, but survivors, and in that lay a power far exceeding the brute force he had always valued. These humans did not contend for dominance. They fought for one another, for survival, for a future. And that, he realized, was something his dominion had never comprehended. As he watched them, the warrior king felt an unfamiliar sentiment stirring within him: respect. These were not the feeble creatures he had dismissed in the past. Their strength was quiet, but it was present. Every action they undertook, every word they uttered, carried a weight of resolve foreign to the cold calculations of the alien races he had once allied with. The humans were different. They were propelled by something more profound, something that did not rely on fear or control. He found himself reflecting on his own rule, his past. The alliances he had forged were predicated on power and dread. His dominion thrived because he was more formidable than those around him, and those who followed him did so out of necessity, not devotion. The moment he displayed weakness, they had abandoned him. But these humans, they remained. Not because they were compelled to, but because they desired to. It was a concept that unsettled him. For so long, he had viewed loyalty as something to be commanded, to be demanded. But here, with these humans, loyalty was an inherent quality, earned. And in their actions, he glimpsed something he had never considered possible: trust, unreserved and unconditional. He did not articulate these thoughts, of course, not yet. His pride still held him captive, though it no longer exerted the same iron grip it once had. The humans, to their credit, never pressed him. They seemed to understand that his silence was no longer hostility, but introspection. They afforded him the space to reconcile his former convictions with this emerging reality. One evening, as the sun descended upon the barren planet, the human leader approached him once more. She posed no questions. Instead, she sat beside him, gazing towards the horizon. After a few moments of quietude, she spoke, not of him, but of their mission, their people. She recounted how humanity had been overlooked by the major galactic powers, how they had been deemed insignificant in the grand cosmic scheme. But rather than letting that break them, it had ignited their resolve to prove themselves. They did not seek to dominate, to conquer, like so many other races. They sought recognition, a place in the galaxy where they could be acknowledged for their resilience. The warrior king felt a pang of recognition. He had once harbored that same drive, that same ambition to validate his worth in a galaxy that had doubted him. He had striven for power, for supremacy, to demonstrate his superiority over all others. But these humans were not striving for power. They were striving for something far more profound: dignity, a place of belonging without the necessity of subjugating others. It was a revelation that shook him to his core. He spoke then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. His voice was rough and unused, but it carried the weight of one who had endured prolonged silence. He inquired of the human leader why they had rescued him, why they had gone to such lengths to assist someone who possessed nothing to offer in return, someone who had once dismissed their entire species as beneath him. Her reply was straightforward: because it was the right thing to do. Those words resonated within his mind long after their conversation concluded. In all his years of rule, in all the conflicts he had waged and the empires he had established, he had never contemplated such a notion. Acting not for power, not for personal gain, but simply because it was morally correct. It was a concept that had no place in the cutthroat politics of his dominion. Yet here, with these humans, it was their guiding principle. The warrior king's introspection deepened. He had always firmly believed that strength was the sole valuable currency. His empire had flourished because he was the strongest, the most merciless. But now, as he sat among these humans, he began to question that conviction. Was strength truly the only path to leadership? Was power truly more significant than loyalty, than trust, than adhering to what was right? It was a question he had never posed to himself before, and now it would not cease to plague him. The more time he spent with the humans, the more he began to perceive the merit in their perspective. They did not need to govern through fear or coercion. They governed through unity, through a bond far deeper than any alliance he had ever forged. They did not abandon their own when adversity struck. They stood by each other, not out of obligation, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. For the first time in his life, the warrior king grasped the essence of true leadership. It was not about commanding legions or conquering worlds. It was about earning the trust and devotion of those around you, about being the kind of leader whom people followed not out of apprehension, but out of profound respect. And that, more than anything else, was the lesson these humans had imparted to him. The moment for decision arrived sooner than he had anticipated. His body, though still bearing the scars of conflict, had regained its vitality. But it was not solely his physical recuperation that was complete. Something within him had undergone a transformation. He could no longer disregard the truth that had been gradually dawning upon him during his time with the humans. Power, as he had always understood it, was insufficient. Not anymore. As the humans prepared to depart the planet, their mission accomplished, the warrior king made a choice he had never conceived of making. He implored them to remain. Not because he required their salvation. He was far beyond that. No, this time, he desired them to stand with him, not as rescuers, but as equals. He outlined his strategy. His dominion, though fragmented and scattered, was not yet lost. There were still those who would pledge their allegiance to him, who believed in his leadership. But it would not be an easy endeavor. His former confederates, the very ones who had betrayed him, had seized control of vital territories, claiming them as their own in his absence. They presumed him either deceased or too incapacitated to return. He intended to prove them mistaken. The humans, to his astonishment, did not hesitate. They neither questioned his motives nor sought assurances. They simply agreed. It was a testament to their character, their unwavering commitment to those they trusted. And though he still found it challenging to vocalize, the warrior king had come to place his trust in them. He now understood that their loyalty was not born of fear or obligation, but from something far more potent. That loyalty was a force he could no longer deny, nor could he afford to lose. With the humans by his side, the king initiated his plan. Their modest vessel was no match for the fleets now dominating his empire, but that was inconsequential. They did not require brute force to triumph. The humans, with their inventiveness and unconventional tactics, possessed an uncanny ability to transform even the simplest instruments into effective tools. He had witnessed this firsthand during his convalescence. They thought differently, acted differently, and in this situation, that divergence was precisely what was needed. They struck under the cloak of night, targeting a communications outpost that had been commandeered by one of the alien races that had once served him. It was a minor victory, but a crucial one. With control of the outpost, they now possessed access to intelligence regarding the current state of the Empire, concerning who wielded power and where. More importantly, it served as a declaration. The warrior king was not vanquished. He was returning. Word spread rapidly. His adversaries reacted with shock and disbelief. They had believed him too broken, too feeble to ever pose a threat again, and now, here he was, reclaiming his empire, piece by piece. Some of the alien commanders, those who had profited from his downfall, began to panic. They had seized his territories by force, but they recognized they could not hold them against his strategic acumen for long. Still, others prepared for conflict, resolute in their determination to retain what they had stolen, confident that the fractured remnants of his forces would be no match for their armies. But they underestimated the humans. It was not their numbers or their weaponry that rendered them formidable, but their unpredictability, their refusal to yield even when the odds were overwhelmingly against them. The humans were not fighting for territory or dominion. They were fighting for something deeper, something the alien races could never comprehend. And that made them a formidable threat. With the warrior king leading the charge, they began to retake key positions one after another. Each triumph, though modest, bolstered their momentum. And as news of the king's return disseminated, those who had once served him began to rally to his cause, not out of fear this time, but out of genuine respect. The betrayal that had nearly cost him his life had not broken him. If anything, it had forged him anew, making him stronger. The ultimate confrontation arrived sooner than anticipated. The alien races, realizing their grip on the Empire was loosening, coalesced to mount a final stand. They amassed their forces at one of the Empire's most strategically vital locations, a fortified planet that had once served as the core of the king's military operations. It was there they believed they could finally crush him definitively, bringing an end to his resurgence before it could gain further traction. But the warrior king had learned from his time with the humans. He no longer relied solely on brute force and overwhelming might. His approach was different now, calculated, precise. He led his troops with a clarity of purpose he had not possessed previously, and the humans, with their ingenuity and persistence, played an integral role in his strategy. As the battle unfolded, it became evident that the alien races had committed a critical miscalculation. They were fighting as they always had, focused on power, on numbers, on subjugation. But the king and his human allies fought with something more: determination, mutual trust, and a purpose that extended beyond mere conquest. The alien armies, despite their considerable size, began to falter. Victory was not swift, but it was assured. The enemy commanders, recognizing their imminent defeat, fled, leaving their forces in disarray. And as the dust settled on the battlefield, the warrior king stood victorious once more. His empire was not what it had once been. It was diminished, more precarious, but it was his again. And this time, it was built upon something far more robust than fear. In the aftermath, the humans prepared to depart. Their mission was complete. But as they stood at the edge of the battlefield, ready to return to their own world, the warrior king approached them. He owed them more than just his life. They had shown him a new way, a new understanding of what it meant to lead, to govern, and he was not prepared to let them go. He offered them a place within his newly established empire, not as subjects or soldiers, but as true allies, as equals. They had proven their worth to him in ways no other race ever had, and he knew that with them by his side, his empire could flourish once more. It was no longer about power, it was about trust, about loyalty, and about the kind of strength that could only arise from unity. The humans, though surprised by the proposition, accepted, not because they sought power or territory, but because they had come to respect the warrior king as much as he had come to respect them. Together, they would rebuild what had been lost, not through domination, but through collaboration. And so, the warrior king's empire was reborn, not as the cold, fear-driven apparatus it had once been, but as something new, something stronger. With the humans at his side, he would lead, not through fear, but through trust, through loyalty, and through the lessons he had learned in the most desolate moments of his existence.